July 1944. The war in the Pacific had reached a fevered rhythm of fire and exhaustion. In the gray fields outside Mukden, Manchuria, a shape lay broken in the mud, gleaming silver, even under the smoke-stained sky. Japanese soldiers surrounded it cautiously, rifles raised as if the thing could still breathe. What they saw was not a Zero, nor a B-29, nor anything they had ever encountered. It was enormous, its wings, wider than any hangar in the region, could hold its fuselage curved like the body of a ship. The air smelled of burnt oil and salt metal. To the men watching, it looked less like an aircraft than a fallen star. By noon, word had reached Tokyo. The wreck was American. A new type of long-range bomber reported to have attacked Yawata just hours earlier. Japanese command understood immediately what it meant: a weapon that could reach the home islands from bases far beyond fighter range. They cabled Berlin that same evening. Within a week, a small team of German engineers boarded a transport plane bound for Manchuria. Among them was Hauptmann Erich Müller, an airframe specialist from the Junkers Works in Dessau. He had spent the last 2 years perfecting rivet spacing on Ju-88 bombers, until now the pride of the Reich's aviation corps. When the plane touched down in Mukden, he expected to see another Allied curiosity. What he saw instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. The wreck had been pulled onto a makeshift ramp. The nose cone was crushed, the tail sheared cleanly, but the main fuselage remained eerily intact. Even in ruin, the machine radiated precision. The skin panels, polished aluminum, fit together so tightly that Müller could barely insert a knife blade between the seams. The Japanese technicians had already begun cataloging parts, yet progress was slow. They lacked tools fine enough to remove certain bolts without damaging them. Müller knelt beside one of the engines, a Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone, and traced his finger along the housing. It was unlike any radial he had ever studied. Immense cylinders, turbo supercharger assemblies, thicker than a man's torso, wiring loomed in neat bundles and coated with a rubberized material unfamiliar to him. He wrote one sentence in his notebook: "This is not a bomber, this is an ecosystem." The more they examined, the more impossible it became to explain. The aircraft was mostly aluminum, but not the brittle alloy the Luftwaffe used. The Japanese metallurgists suspected a heat-treated compound 75 ST with tensile strength unmatched by any German supplier. Every inch of the fuselage seemed to mock them with its simplicity. The Americans had managed what German engineers had long dreamed of: continuous, unbroken panels shaped by massive hydraulic presses rather than patchwork plates. It was beauty born of machinery, not craftsmanship. Müller stood back, wiping his hands on his coat, and whispered, "They've built a bomber as if it were a product, not a prototype." Inside the shattered cockpit, the smell of ozone and scorched insulation lingered. The Germans noted sealed joints, pressurized conduits, and a cockpit layout arranged for comfort as much as control. There were padded seats, thermal lining, even adjustable lighting. To Müller, it felt alien. "We are still building aircraft by hand," he muttered. "They are building them by civilization." He realized then that the Reich's faith in precision mechanics, its obsession with the artisan engineer, was obsolete. Here lay proof that America had moved beyond artistry into pure industrialization. Outside, the Manchurian wind carried dust across the field, catching in the fragments of the bomber's polished skin. The Japanese officers, proud but weary, looked to their German counterparts for answers. Müller said little. What could he say? The machine spoke for itself. Its presence in this remote corner of Asia was both a miracle and a warning. The Allies had built something that defied the logic of the Axis industrial world, a weapon too vast to be countered by brilliance alone. That evening, as floodlights bathed the wreck in pale glow, the technicians began their work in earnest. They mapped every curve, measured every rivet, photographed every angle. A crane lifted the wing sections onto wooden trestles where German and Japanese engineers argued quietly over measurements. One man compared the surface finish to that of a commercial automobile. Another disagreed. No, it's finer. This is the future of war, manufactured like a consumer good. Nearby, a soldier scraped away a handful of mud and found a plate stamped with a simple name, Boeing. For Miller, that word carried more terror than any bomb. Boeing was not a genius, not a hero, not a secret. It was a factory. The realization settled in his chest like a stone. The Allies had built not just machines, but systems that could replicate perfection thousands of times over. In Germany, a single bomber took weeks of labor by craftsmen. In America, an identical bomber rolled off the line every hour. The war, Miller thought, had already been decided not by battles, but by blueprints. He closed his notebook and watched the horizon darken over Manchuria. "They've reached a century we haven't even imagined yet," he said quietly. The others didn't answer. Somewhere beyond the hills, the low hum of another engine echoed one more B-29 heading toward a target that couldn't defend itself. If you believe the true battlefield of World War II was not in Europe or the Pacific, but inside the factories of America, comment 1. If you think victory still belonged to strategy, not steel, then press like. And don't forget to subscribe, because what they found next inside the wreck would make even the most loyal engineer question everything he believed about power. The wreck was no longer a mystery. It was an autopsy. For 3 days, the joint German-Japanese technical team dissected the silver giant piece by piece, working under the constant hum of generators and the smell of burned oil. The sun in Manchuria was merciless, but the engineers barely noticed. They were inside something that felt impossible, something that had no right to exist in 1944. The first thing they uncovered were the wings. Each section was a cathedral of aluminum ribbed spars and hydraulic lines so perfectly fitted that not a single screw appeared misaligned. A Japanese engineer ran his hand along the inside of the frame and said softly, "This was not built, it was printed by the gods." The German interpreter didn't translate that line. Miller, standing nearby, heard it anyway. At Junkers, every bomber was built from plates, each hammered, bent, and joined by hand. On the B-29, the Germans discovered a single continuous extrusion stretching from wing root to tip. The joints were invisible, the rivets sunk, flushed the panels cold and smooth as glass. They pried one open reluctantly and found layers of structural reinforcement that should have added weight, yet somehow the entire assembly felt lighter than the Heinkels. The alloy, they noted, was not ordinary duralumin. It was something else, heat-treated, age-hardened, a secret mixture that neither German nor Japanese metallurgy could reproduce. Then came the engines. 4 Wright R-3350 duplex cyclones, each one capable of 2,200 horsepower, fitted with twin turbo superchargers. When the German engineers dismantled one of the turbos, they stared at it in silence. The machining was perfect. Every impeller blade gleamed like a mirror. No casting flaws, no imbalance. The housing was seamless. Miller took one measurement, then another. He compared it to the specs of the Daimler-Benz DB603, Germany's most advanced power plant, The American turbocharger operated at almost double the pressure, yet ran smoother. "They've mastered heat," he murmured. "We're still learning to control it." The Japanese officer beside him frowned. "Could we copy it?" Muller shook his head. "Even if we had the drawings, we lack the furnaces, the alloys, the patience. They are not building engines, they are building continuity." Inside the fuselage, the shocks multiplied. The internal layout was unlike any bomber they knew. It was organized not for pilots, but for efficiency. Each compartment was pressurized, connected by narrow tunnels that allowed the crew to move without oxygen masks. The Germans tested the seals airtight. The window glass was layered, resistant to shattering. A simple plaque read, "Cabin pressure maintained 8.6 psi at $30,000 feet." Miller stared at it, thinking of the Luftwaffe's desperate attempts to make their own pressurized cabins work. None had lasted longer than an hour in flight. The Americans had turned it into routine engineering. When they reached the cockpit, their notes slowed into silence. The controls were labeled with printed tags, not hand-stamped metal. The gauges glowed faintly from a regulated current. Even the wiring looked unreal, each cable neatly bound, color-coded, wrapped in plastic insulation instead of the brittle rubber Germany used. A Japanese technician cut one open and blinked. "It's not copper," he said. Miller examined the shining thread. "Silver alloy," he whispered. Their wiring planes like laboratories. The gun turrets brought the next revelation. Each was remotely operated, controlled from the pressurized cabin through periscopic sights and electric servos. To the Germans, this was sorcery. They had imagined such systems in sketches, but here it was alive, tangible, reliable. Each turret carried twin 50 caliber Brownings linked to a central fire control computer. The word computer wasn't one they used yet, but the Americans had already built it in steel. That night they dined in the hangar, surrounded by pieces of the aircraft. The smell of machine oil mixed with the sweetness of canned American rations recovered from the wreck. One of the Japanese officers unwrapped a chocolate bar stamped with the Hershey's logo. He looked at it, then at the B-29's aluminum ribs, and laughed bitterly. "They can feed their soldiers with sugar and still build this." Miller wrote furiously in his notebook. He drew diagrams, annotated alloy samples, listed every component by weight. By the second day, he stopped using exclamation marks. The astonishment had turned into resignation. "This machine," he wrote, "is not the product of a design office. It is the child of a civilization built for endless reproduction." The next morning, the team inspected the bomb bay doors. They opened with hydraulic precision, smooth and silent. The pistons were polished to a mirror sheen. "This is factory work," said Muller. "Identical tolerances every part. They don't just build one bomber, they build 1,000 exactly alike." The numbers haunted him. One B-29 required 2.5 million man-hours to assemble, yet the United States could produce 100 per month. That single fact reduced every German invention, every secret project to irrelevance. The Reich had been proud of its Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, its rockets, its submarines. But each of those wonders existed in handfuls. The Americans had achieved something far greater: consistency. When the inspection reached the landing gear, a Japanese engineer crouched and whistled. "It retracts hydraulically," he said. "We can do that." But when they examined the fluid reservoirs, they found filters finer than anything available in Axis factories. Even the hoses were labeled with printed maintenance schedules. Nothing had been left to improvisation. As night fell, the German engineers gathered in the command hut. The mood was heavy. Miller stood at the chalkboard covered with notes, sketches, and comparisons. He pointed to the top line, B-29 Super Fortress, the industrial ideal. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we are not competing with an aircraft. We are competing with an ecosystem. They have factories that build factories. We cannot fight that with talent. We would need an entire world." No one argued. The Japanese colonel lit a cigarette and stared at the diagrams. "Then, we are already behind," Muller nodded. "By a century," he said, "maybe two." Outside, the wind swept across the empty airfield, carrying with it the faint echo of engines far above the sound of another B-29 passing overhead on its way to a new target. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Even as they studied the fallen giant, its siblings were multiplying beyond reach. If you believe the real weapon of America was not its bombs, but the factories that could replace them overnight, comment 2. If you still think genius, not mass production, defines power, then press like. And subscribe, because what they would uncover next inside the wreck would make even the proudest engineer question what it truly means to be advanced. By the fourth day, the wreck no longer felt like a relic of war. It had become a cathedral of precision. Every panel, every wire, every sealed edge whispered of a logic that transcended battle. The German and Japanese engineers no longer spoke of copying it. They spoke of understanding it as one might study a civilization discovered beneath the ice. The next task was the cockpit. The Japanese mechanics had already cleared debris from the front fuselage and built a wooden platform to access the shattered glass dome. Miller climbed first, followed by Lieutenant Hasegawa, the youngest among them, who carried a notebook too clean for the place they were standing. Inside, the air was stale with the scent of burnt insulation and something faintly sweet, hydraulic fluid mixed with plastic. The controls were bent but intact. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The space looked less like a cockpit and more like an office, padded seats with adjustable frames, armrests lined with fine stitching dials, arranged not by habit, but by ergonomics. The Americans had thought of comfort even at 30,000 feet. To Miller, who had flown in prototype bombers that froze the skin off one's face, it felt surreal. He tapped one of the cracked gauges with his pen. The label read, "Cabin pressure maintained 8.6 psi at altitude." The implication struck him like a hammer. The B-29 was not just designed to fly higher, it was designed for its crew to live there, sealed away from the war outside. "They built an atmosphere," he muttered. The inspection continued. Hasegawa traced the edge of a rubber-sealed joint and found it unbroken despite the crash. He pressed it with his finger. It sprang back airtight. "Synthetic polymer," Miller said. "We'd need an entire chemical plant to make this much." He pointed to the ductwork above them, smooth curved aluminum tubes running through the fuselage. Each line carried filtered heated air from an environmental control system that the Axis hadn't even dreamed of implementing. On a clipboard recovered near the navigator's seat, they found a maintenance log written in pencil, temperature readings, pressure adjustments, oxygen flow rates. The handwriting was neat, methodical, almost casual. The Americans had made climate control routine. For the Axis, it was a luxury reserved for submarines and research labs. One of the German engineers switched on a handheld light and followed the wiring beneath the dashboard. "Color-coded," he said. "Each system insulated, tagged, traced." Miller nodded. "In Berlin, we rely on memory. Here they rely on order." He ran his gloved fingers along the cables, smooth plastic, not the brittle rubber of German designs. The difference was more than material. It was mindset. Then they found the most stunning detail of all: a single glass dome housing what appeared to be a gyroscopic autopilot connected to an early analog computer. The system used vacuum tubes and servo motors to maintain stability. It was not invention for invention's sake. It was discipline, mechanized. The Americans had transformed complexity into procedure. The Japanese officers outside grew restless. "We have learned enough," one of them said. Miller shook his head. "No. We've only seen what it does. We haven't seen why it works." He pointed to the seams along the interior bulkhead. This is manufacturing at its purest form. Every part fits every other. No adjustment, no tolerance stacking. They're building aircraft the way we build watches, only thousands of times larger. They took samples of insulation glass and aluminum skin, but it was the quiet details that broke their morale. On the back of the pilot's seat, someone found a small instruction plate engraved with maintenance notes: "Replace filter after 600 hours of operation." Miller stared at the line, realizing what it implied. These bombers were meant to last. Germany's bombers were built to survive missions. America's were built to survive wars. When dusk fell, they gathered their notes in silence. The heat of the day had faded, replaced by the dry hiss of wind through the hangar doors. Miller sat on a crate, his notebook open on his knees, sketching the curvature of the cockpit glass. "It's almost art," Hasegawa said. Miller closed his book. "No," he replied. "Art dies with the artist. This will not." He looked around at the others. Every man wore the same expression, a mix of awe and despair. They were engineers staring not at an enemy, but at an inevitable future. What they saw was not merely superiority, it was inevitability shaped in aluminum. Later that night, as they returned to their quarters, Hasegawa paused by the doorway. "Do you think we can ever build something like this?" he asked. Miller shook his head. "Perhaps, but not soon. This isn't about design or skill. It's about how they think. We build perfection one piece at a time. They build it in millions." Outside, the airfield was silent, except for the faint echo of crickets. The wreck of the B-29 lay under a tarpaulin, its silver skin glinting under moonlight. To any passerby, it was a dead machine. To Miller, it was something alive, proof that America had discovered the next phase of civilization. He returned to his desk, lit a cigarette, and wrote a single line before closing his journal: "They have made comfort into a weapon." If you believe true superiority isn't just power, but the ability to make power effortless, comment 3. If you think war should never be that efficient, press like and subscribe, because what they would see next inside the factories that built this monster would show why the war had already been lost before a single bomb fell. The wreck in Manchuria lay silent under its tarp, but across the Pacific, its identical twin was being born, one of 100 that month. The sound of hammers and rivet guns rolled through the Kansas plains like distant thunder. Inside Boeing Plant No. 1 in Wichita, the air shimmered with heat and movement. Rows of assembly lines stretched farther than the eye could see, nearly 2 miles of mechanized choreography. A foreman's whistle cut through the clatter. Thousands of men and women moved in rhythm welders and denim overalls, women in kerchiefs guiding rivet heads into place, inspectors tapping on aluminum skin with rubber mallets. It wasn't chaos. It was music, industrial, relentless, precise. Every 30 minutes, a fuselage section advanced down the track. Every hour, a bomber was one step closer to flight. At the far end of the hall, the nose sections gleamed beneath skylights. They were identical down to the last rivet, each stamped with the same serial number, prefix 426, an assembly mark so standardized that spare parts could fit any plane, anytime. In another corner, workers tightened bolts in oxygen systems following printed manuals that reduced engineering to repetition. A poster on the wall read, "Perfection is a process." The numbers defied imagination. Each B-29 required more than 150,000 individual parts, 1,200 sub-assemblies, and 2.6 million hours of labor. But here production wasn't measured in sweat. It was measured in rhythm. The plant ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, powered by a labor force of 30,000, many of them women who had never seen an airplane before the war. They worked in 3 shifts, sleeping in dormitories built beside the factory their children cared for, in nurseries paid for by Boeing. Across America, there were 4 other plants just like it in Marietta, Georgia, Renton, Washington, Omaha, Nebraska, and Seattle, each specialized in a single section of the aircraft. Wings in Wichita, fuselages in Marietta, tail assemblies in Renton. When finished, the parts converged by rail in a ballet of logistics so exact that a complete bomber could roll out every 63 minutes. In Germany, the Me-262 jet fighter was still hand-assembled by craftsmen, 1 per week in underground tunnels lit by lanterns. In America, the B-29 was built by women listening to swing music. The contrast was almost cruel. The Reich's engineers had brilliance, but America had infrastructure. While Europe starved, the United States consumed more aluminum in a week than Germany did in a month. By 1944, America controlled 65% of the world's aluminum supply, 80% of its aviation fuel, and half of all machine tools on Earth. The scale was biblical. If war was an equation of logistics, the Americans had solved it. From an observation catwalk, Boeing's chief production officer, Ed Wells, watched the lines move like arteries. Below, workers in powder blue uniforms drilled rivets into a B-29 wing panel so large it required its own building. Each rivet was driven by air tools calibrated to the same torque across every plant in the country. Wells smiled. "Precision doesn't need geniuses," he said to a visiting general. "It needs systems that don't get tired." At the same hour, thousands of miles away in Manchuria, Hauptmann Miller sat at his desk, writing by lantern light. His pen scratched across the page. It would take Germany 10 years to reach their current speed of manufacturing, perhaps longer. He paused, staring at the reflection of his light in the aluminum scrap beside him. "They're building machines faster than we can count." Back in Kansas, a supervisor pinned a new chart on the wall. It showed production goals rising like the steps of a pyramid. The factory's motto stenciled above it read, "Wars are won by schedules." Each part of the process had been reduced to time and motion. Inspectors measured not only the accuracy of the work, but the rhythm of the workers themselves. Conveyor belts rolled at fixed intervals. Radio operators synchronized clocks across plants to the second, and procurement officers calculated raw material deliveries by train car tonnage per hour. The entire machine of war had become self-aware, and yet, amidst all the machinery, there was something deeply human. The workers signed their initials on panels before they were sealed, scribbled messages inside bomb bay doors. "Good luck, boys, bring it home." They worked not with hatred, but with momentum. Production had replaced passion as the heart of warfare. In August 1944, Boeing Plant No. 1 completed its 500th B-29. A brass band played as factory doors opened and sunlight flooded the hangar. The bomber, silver and perfect, rolled out on its landing gear like a living monument to repetition. The workers cheered, their faces streaked with oil and pride. Cameras flashed. One reporter asked a welder what it felt like to build a weapon that could fly halfway across the world. She shrugged. "It feels like doing your part," she said. From the Midwest to the Pacific, the numbers climbed without end. 2,000 B-29s by year's end. 70,000 aircraft of all types rolling off American lines every year. In Berlin, Allied bombers dropped more tons of explosives in a month than Germany had dropped in the entire war. The Axis still fought, but the math was no longer in their favor. Miller saw the same truth in his own notes. "Even if we built one," he wrote, "we would need 1,000 more to matter." He looked at the blueprint spread before him, the one copied from the B-29's wing section. The lines were perfect, the ratios beautiful, but they meant nothing without the machinery to reproduce them. The realization came with the weight of prophecy. America didn't just build weapons, they built the means to build them forever. The war was not being won in the skies or seas, but in the hum of electric drills and the rhythm of shift changes. It was being won in factories where mistakes were counted in seconds, not deaths. At Boeing Wichita, another whistle blew. The night shift began. Thousands of lights blinked on, flooding the factory floor in white brilliance. The workers picked up where the last crew had stopped, as if the day had never ended. The conveyor belts rolled, the rivets hammered, and the future marched forward. If you believe the real battlefield of World War II wasn't Europe or the Pacific, but the American factory floor, comment 4. If you think victory still belonged to generals, not engineers, press like. And subscribe, because what happened next, when the Axis tried to copy the superfortress, would prove just how far behind they really were. By September 1944, the wreck of the B-29 in Manchuria had been stripped to its bones. The crates of parts, engines, sections of wing, fragments of instruments were loaded onto trains bound for Tokyo under orders stamped top secret. The Japanese military called it Project Koken-Ki, an attempt to reproduce the American giant. In Berlin, the Luftwaffe's Technical Bureau received copies of the drawings through the diplomatic pouch. What had begun as curiosity had turned into obsession. At the Nakajima Aircraft Works outside Tokyo, engineers gathered around the crates as if they contained sacred relics. They laid the parts out on long tables and began to trace every bolt, every panel line. The logic was simple. If America could build such a bomber, Japan would build its twin. But the logic broke down the moment the first wrench turned. The alloy wouldn't cut properly. The dies for shaping the ribs cracked after the second press. The rivets seized under heat. The Japanese machinists worked with tools built for fabric-covered fighters, not for aircraft that weighed 60 tons. The B-29 skin required hydraulic presses capable of exerting thousands of tons of force machines that existed only in America's factories. The workers tried to improvise hammering the plates by hand, but the aluminum warped. What the Americans shaped in seconds, the Japanese couldn't reproduce in weeks. When the first report reached Berlin, it read like confession. Replication impossible, without equivalent industrial facilities. Miller read the memo by lamplight in Manchuria and felt the sentence settle into his bones. Replication impossible. The Reich had said the same thing years earlier about radar, about proximity fuses, about code machines. The Americans didn't invent faster, they manufactured faster. Germany had tried its own imitation months earlier. Juncker's engineers studying a captured B-17 had drafted plans for a long-range bomber they called the Ju-390. The project devoured resources, and the prototype barely lifted off before the program collapsed under shortages of fuel and alloy. Even if it had flown, it would have been one miracle against thousands. In 1944, miracles no longer mattered. In Japan, the Koken-Ki project continued through the autumn. The engineers worked by candlelight as power shortages deepened. Each new test piece revealed another missing technology. The Americans used a heat-treating process that hardened the aluminum without warping it. Japan's furnaces couldn't maintain the temperature evenly. Their welding rods left bubbles that fractured under pressure. The B-29's flawless skin remained as unreachable as the sky it had flown in. One of the younger engineers wrote in his diary, "We have the shape, but not the soul." The same was true across the Reich. By late 1944, Allied bombers had reduced German aluminum output by 70%. Railroads were crippled factories scattered underground. Skilled workers were gone, drafted dead or displaced. The few remaining machines still ran, but there was no fuel to power them, no copper for wiring, no rubber for tires. Every B-29 that rolled off an American line now represented not just a plane, but an equation the Axis could no longer solve. Materials multiplied by time, multiplied by peace of mind. In Manchuria, Miller stood beside the crates of parts waiting for shipment westward. He picked up a section of tubing stamped with Boeing's logo and ran his thumb along its edge. Perfect. Not a burr, not a scratch. The Japanese colonel beside him asked, "How do they make so many so perfect?" Miller answered without looking up. "Because they built the world around them to make it possible." The colonel frowned. "We can copy their blueprints. You can copy a song," Miller replied, "but without the orchestra, it's only noise." By winter, the B-29 fragments that reached Berlin were already obsolete. The Americans had improved the design, streamlining the nose and replacing the engines with more reliable R-33 523s. The Luftwaffe's analysts, working in the ruins of Charlottenburg, reviewed the data and quietly shelved it. No report could hide the truth. The war's technology gap had become a chasm of civilization itself. Meanwhile, the real B-29s, alive and multiplying, filled the skies. From the Marianas, they flew missions thousands of kilometers across the Pacific. They burned oil refineries in Formosa airfields, in Shanghai factories, in Nagoya. The bomber that had fallen in Manchuria was already ancient history. The machine the Germans studied was not even the peak. It was a snapshot of a process still accelerating beyond their reach. Miller received another memo that winter, a request for his professional opinion. Can German industry produce an equivalent? He stared at the page before answering with one sentence, "Only if we can rebuild the planet." He closed his notebook. The war he'd believed in, the war of invention, of daring, of genius, was over. The new war was fought by schedules, logistics, and the math of abundance. America's greatest weapon wasn't ingenuity, it was inevitability. That spring, Allied bombers began pounding Tokyo with firestorms born from the same assembly lines that had produced the wreck in Manchuria. The irony was merciless. While Japan tried to replicate one fallen B-29, hundreds of its siblings were already erasing the very factories that attempted the copy. In the end, Project Koken-Ki never left the ground. The last surviving engineer wrote in his final report, "We built wings without air. If you believe a design can be stolen, but a system cannot," comment. 5. If you think genius still outweighs mass production, press like. And subscribe, because what Miller would realize next in that frozen Manchurian hangar would change how he saw war itself and how humanity defines progress. Winter came early to Manchuria. The rice fields around Mukden froze into mirrors of gray ice, and the airfield that once smelled of fuel and humidity now reeked of rust and emptiness. Inside the hangar, The B-29's remains lay silent beneath a crust of frost. The tarpaulin stiffened like armor, the silver skin of the wreck catching the flicker of lantern light from a single desk in the corner. Hauptmann Erich Müller sat alone, coat draped over his shoulders, a cigarette burning between his fingers. Around him were the relics of a civilization he did not belong to, sections of aluminum ribs, sealed hydraulic lines, and fragments of instruments that no German factory could replicate. On the wall, pinned between maps and blueprints, hung a small metal plate stamped with a name he could not stop reading: Boeing, Wichita, Kansas. He had stared at it for hours. The word had begun to lose meaning, turning from a company name into a prophecy. Boeing was not a designer, not a man. It was an organism, alive and self-sustaining. Its pulse was the hum of machinery thousands of miles away. Its veins were the railways and shipyards of a continent untouched by war. Every rivet on the B-29's body was a cell in that creature's body, every bomber a breath. The machine had become its own species, and America its habitat. The Japanese guards avoided the hangar now. They called the wreck cursed a monument to a power too vast to comprehend. Müller didn't argue. He found solace there, surrounded by silence and symmetry. He would trace his gloved fingers across the edges of the fuselage, the metal still cold but smooth, unyielding. Each touch felt like acknowledgement, a gesture of respect between two engineers separated by civilization. He opened his notebook, the one he had started months earlier when the wreck first arrived. Its pages were filled with drawings, measurements, and notes, written in a hand that had grown more hesitant with each entry. He read one line from early autumn: "This machine is not a bomber. It is a factory that flies." He smiled bitterly. Back then, the phrase had sounded clever. Now it felt like confession. Müller thought of the factories back home. He pictured the underground tunnels at Nordhausen, where slave laborers built rockets by torchlight. He remembered the rumors of aircraft assembled in caves, of engineers dying for lack of food, of production lines that collapsed under the weight of exhaustion. Germany's ingenuity had become its own cage. The Reich still believed it could invent its way out of ruin. But invention was not enough anymore. Not against a nation that could mass-produce perfection without flinching. He rose from the desk and walked toward the wreck. The moonlight through the hangar roof painted the metal in pale blue streaks. He stopped at the cockpit. Its glass shattered, its instruments scattered, and peered inside. There in the twisted frame, he saw his reflection mingled with the bombers. He looked older than he remembered. "You were never our enemy," he whispered to the machine. "You were our replacement." He sat again, the wooden chair creaking beneath him, and wrote his final entry. His handwriting was steady now, as if the cold had burned away all hesitation. "We believed we were the masters of engineering. We believed genius could conquer time. But this is not genius. This is order. This is civilization made mechanical. The Americans have built a weapon that no bomb can destroy the system itself. We will lose not because they fight better, but because they manufacture the future while we still forge the past." He stopped, exhaled, and watched his breath fog in the air. The sound of distant engines echoed faintly beyond the hills. He recognized the tone instantly, 4 radial engines climbing through the thin night air. Another B-29 flying overhead. He listened until the hum faded into silence. For a brief, foolish moment, he felt gratitude, not for victory or survival, but for witnessing what perfection looked like before it buried him. When dawn came, frost had crept across the hangar floor, turning every metal surface white. Miller stood by the wreck one last time, touching the edge of the wing where the American logo had once been painted. The paint had burned away, but beneath the soot, the letters B-29 Superfortress were still faintly visible. He ran his hand across them like a priest reading a scripture. "You were not built to kill," he murmured. "You were built to outlast." Outside, the Japanese guards prepared to abandon the site. Soviet forces were moving closer every week. Miller didn't bother to pack. The reports were already finished. The conclusions didn't need him anymore. The bomber had spoken louder than any scientist could. That night, as he prepared to leave, he looked one final time at the metal plate from the wreck Boeing, Wichita, and slipped it into his pocket. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. He would carry it across continents through defeat and captivity, through the fall of his empire and the birth of another age. Years later, when he stood in a rebuilt Berlin and watched the first jetliners cross the sky, he would recognize the same perfection in their shape. The future had come from Kansas, not from Berlin. He left the hangar without looking back. Behind him, the wind howled through the gaps in the roof, whistling softly against the aluminum skeleton, a sound halfway between a sigh and a hymn. If you believe that true defeat comes not from losing battles, but from realizing your enemy has already built the future, comment 6. If you think war is still won by courage alone, press like. And subscribe, because what follows next, the final lesson of this discovery, will show that the greatest weapon of all was not destruction, but prediction. By the time the war ended, the wreck in Manchuria had rusted into silence. Grass had grown through its broken wings, and the cold rain of the Asian plains washed away the fingerprints of every man who had studied it. The B-29 was no longer a weapon, no longer an enemy. It had become a fossil of the future. Across the ocean, the factories that had built it were still alive, humming without pause. Boeing, Wichita, Marietta, Renton, the same plants that had once forged bombers, now began turning out civilian airliners, cargo transports, and research prototypes. Where the Luftwaffe had left ruins, the Americans left assembly lines. Their war machine hadn't stopped when peace arrived. It had merely changed shape. In 1945, while Europe counted its dead, the United States produced more steel than the rest of the world combined. Its factories exported engines, trucks, and turbines by the thousands. A nation built to destroy had discovered that it could create faster than anyone could recover. The weapon had evolved into an economy. The numbers told the story no propaganda could. During the war, the United States built 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and 2.4 million trucks. Its factories consumed half of the world's copper and 3/4 of its aviation fuel. In the same 4 years, Germany's industrial output had collapsed by 70%, Japan's by 90%. For every ton of steel the Axis produced, America made 20. For every bomb the Allies dropped, the Americans built a plane to carry 10 more. But the real victory wasn't measured in tonnage or sorties, it was measured in what survived. When peace came, the same blueprints that had birthed the B-29 became the foundation for a world rebuilt around abundance. Cargo planes became airliners. Military logistics became global trade. The systems that had once fed armies began feeding continents. Hauptmann Müller returned to Berlin in 1946 as a prisoner, thin, quiet, and carrying a small metal plate in his coat pocket. He never spoke of it to the guards, nor to the other engineers he met in captivity. But at night, he would take it out, rub the engraved letters with his thumb, and whisper the word as if it were an incantation Boeing. When he was released years later, he found a city that no longer needed miracles. Germany's factories were rubble, its railways torn apart, its engineers scattered. Yet even amid the ruins, he saw something familiar, a reconstruction plan led not by generals or visionaries, but by men with clipboard schedules and machines. America had not just won the war, it had taught the world how to build the future on time. He visited one of the new Marshall Plan factories rising on the outskirts of Munich. The building smelled of oil and hope. Conveyor belts ran like veins through the concrete skeleton. A young foreman explained that the equipment came from the United States standardized presses, interchangeable tools, electric hoists calibrated to identical torque settings. Miller ran his hand along a freshly machined wing spar and felt a chill of recognition. "They've exported the process," he murmured. "Even peace has become a product." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Boeing company unveiled its first post-war prototype, the Model 377 Stratocruiser, a civilian descendant of the B-29. Its pressurized cabin carried 100 passengers in comfort across oceans that had once been battlefields. Newspapers called it luxury at 30,000 feet. Miller saw the photographs in a European journal and smiled faintly. He recognized the same cockpit glass, the same curve of aluminum that had once terrified him in Manchuria. The machine had shed its bombs, but not its purpose to dominate the skies through production, not destruction. By 1950, the United States was producing half of all manufactured goods on Earth. The nation's factories had become temples of precision, their rituals unchanged since the war repetition substitution improvement. Every refrigerator, every car, every aircraft bore the genetic code of the B-29 modularity, efficiency, abundance. The bomber had not just won a war, it had defined an era. Historians later called it the arsenal of democracy. But Mueller knew better. Democracy had not built the arsenal. Industry had built democracy. The ability to make everything had become the right to choose anything. The same process that riveted wings now built futures. One autumn evening decades later, Miller stood at an air show outside Hanover. He was an old man now, his hair thin, his posture stooped. A silver jetliner roared overhead, its engines smooth and cold, its skin flawless. The announcer's voice echoed through the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Boeing 707, the future of flight." The old engineer smiled. "I've seen this before," he whispered. "Only now it carries passengers instead of bombs." The crowd cheered as the jet disappeared into the clouds. Mueller reached into his coat pocket and felt the worn metal plate still there, edges dulled by time. Boeing, Wichita. It was no longer a name. It was a prophecy fulfilled. He closed his eyes and remembered the hangar in Manchuria, the frost on the wreck, the silence the way the sunlight had touched the polished wing. He realized that he had not studied a bomber at all. He had studied the future. The narrator's voice fades over a montage of archives assembly lines, women riveting aircraft men in hard hats guiding steel girders, cities rising from ashes ships, leaving ports filled with goods instead of guns. The same rhythm that once forged war now powered civilization. Narration: Germany and Japan fought with courage. America fought with capacity. When their engineers touched the B-29, they weren't touching metal. They were touching the 20th century. The war ended, but the machine never stopped. It simply changed what it produced, no longer bombs, but the modern world itself. The camera lingers on an aerial shot of Wichita at dusk, factories, glowing railways, weaving like veins of light, the hum of turbines fading into silence. If you believe that history's greatest victory wasn't won by generals, but by the hands of those who built what others only imagined, comment 7. If you think the future still belongs to the battlefield press, like and subscribe, because some wars are not fought with weapons, but with the will to create what no one else can even dream of.